Welcome to the Therapeutic Food Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Marian Mitchell. I'm an integrative nutrition health coach, therapeutic diet expert, and founder of The Road to Living Whole. There are many different diets out there. It's hard to know which one is right for you with your chronic illness and autoimmune disease. In this podcast, I'm going to share with you the foundational pieces every single therapeutic diet out there shares, and also how to use the best one for your particular diagnosis. If you've been looking for a meal planning partner, help navigating the complicated healthcare system, and want to feel better quickly, I'm your girl. Grab your kombucha and notebook. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, welcome back. I have Brandon Faust of Mold Solutions back again. So last time he was on the podcast, he shared with us what mold remediation looks like, what proper diagnosis looks like, proper remediation, our options in that. Super good. If you haven't listened to that yet, I will tag it in the show notes. Highly recommend. Today, we are going to talk about the different types of mold. So Brandon's based in Florida. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. Completely different terrains. And even here in Phoenix, where it's very dry, we have like 2 wet months a year. February and July are our typical wet months or wet seasons. But mold toxicity is totally a thing. I deal with a lot of local people who are struggling with it. And when Brandon mentioned that he would love to talk about the difference between wet and dry mold, I was like, holy crap, I need to know more. So that's why he's here. So we're all going to learn more together. And I'm really excited. Brandon, please introduce yourself for people who haven't met you yet and tell us your story. And then let's dive into the topic of the day.
Absolutely. And again, thank you for having me back on the show. I love chatting with you and your audience. It's, one of my favorite things to do is really educate people on this topic because it's something that I feel is easily misunderstood. There's fear involved. There is the other end of the spectrum where people don't know about it at all and they don't really think that it's a thing. So where do we kind of meet in the middle where it's being educated and also having a respect for this unassuming organism that can cause some issues, health issues. And those health issues are also quite real, especially for the people that have been exposed to mold and have been debilitated. So to try to tell them that it's not something, it's not a fact. It is something, so I really do enjoy talking about it. So thanks for having me on the show.
Of course.
So in terms of how I got into this arena and in this space, really it was kind of fortuitous. A friend of mine asked me to help him with a company he was going to start running in sales, and he has a very heavy French accent. So being here in the South, those two things didn't really go together. And his wife was like, "Look, we can take over the company, but you're going to need somebody to do the sales and talking about the actual issue itself." So he invited me to come on board. And initially I was not interested at all. Felt like I'm not going to be a mold guy. I felt like it was a step down almost. And then he said, well, there's equity involved if you do come on board. So that piqued my interest enough that I said, okay, yeah, I think I'll consider this. I had a wife that was pregnant and it was time to start planning for the future. And, we got going. And interesting enough, my son was born and I had done certification and training by this point and had gotten enough knowledge of environmental toxicity and mold and environmental triggers that, I was going into people's homes and I was doing walkthroughs and consultations. And then my wife and my son were waking up consistently, and they got to a point where he actually almost started having asthma attacks very early in the morning, waking up, having a hard time breathing, like gasping for air, gasping to breathe. So this happened 3 days in a row. And that was like, for her, that was it. We're taking them to the emergency room. There's something going on. So I said, well, it could be environmental. So let me just apply this knowledge and this, certification that I've just gotten, and let's see if it's in the home. So I started doing a deep dive and I turned this one shelving system, and sure enough, there was 2 feet, up and down and 2 feet wide of mold called Aspergillus penicillium. And it was in the same room that the AC was located. And it was distributing it all throughout the house. So that AC system basically became a distribution plant for this toxic substance. So we handled the leak that was causing it. We removed the contaminated material, and then we did this whole home sanitization, including, sanitizing the ducts. And the next day, he slept an hour longer, and he had no trouble breathing whatsoever. And that was really kind of the moment for me that I said, wow, this is important. And it made a huge difference in regards to my walkthroughs, my consultations, and when I was looking into people's homes to see if they had an issue, because it really became personal at that point. I could see that it was a legit thing that really needed to be discovered if it was there.
I think one of the best things is that you can truly relate. Like it's not something that you just know, something that you just got in because there was money, but you have personal experience with it and you know how dangerous it truly can be and how much it was dismissed in our last interview. You talked about that. The doctors just kind of like dismissed it. And you were like, no, this is thing. And then he was breathing better the next you cleaned it all up. They brought him home and he slept, which
Yeah.
is huge. I mean, that's huge. And, babies are so lucky because their bodies are so efficient at getting rid of things. And like, I'm a canary in the coal mine. So I'm one of the first ones I get sick and I stay sick the longest. And my recovery was really long. And so I love that you are truly invested and, I feel like when it comes to like mold and things, people wonder if it's not money hungry. Is it really legit? They doubt how severe it really is. So you having a personal experience with it, I think adds an extra layer of trust.
Look, it can be. It's one of those areas where not everybody in every profession has that. It's not just, mold guys or duct cleaning, but when you're involved in those, people don't know because they're not going to go into their ducts and then relook, or most people are not going to do that. They trust you as to whether or not you did the job, right?
Hmm.
Or let's say you're doing crawl space cleanup. They're not going to climb under their home. They're just not going to do that. When it comes to mold, they don't know what to look for. And in some cases, you can't even see it. So they're depending upon that person to say it's good, unless they're getting a clearance test from a third party. So you really have to have a moral compass, and you have to have scruples when you're involved in these. It's like almost like a fiduciary duty. Like you have to really have the best interest for the person that you're taking care of at heart. That has to come first and foremost. So I think that the experience with my son made a big difference on that. And then also, you know, 2 years later in 2019, August 2019, I well, it really started in January 2019. I got sick. I was having headaches, fatigue. I had a pain in my chest that would not go away no matter what I would do. I was taking Spanish black radish, like popping it like candy. It was like a drainage, supplement. So I was doing that, but it was still a problem. And I was fatigued, and I ended up taking the mycotoxin test from Mosaic Diagnostics,
Hmm.
and I was like high was like 5 to 50, and I was at 1,215, I believe, was like the number on one of the mycotoxins. And I also was elevated in five different mycotoxins, not just one. So I I had done air samples in my home, and they were clean. I had done I had popped a baseboard, it was clean. Like behind it, it was clean. And I didn't smell anything. I didn't see anything. So I chalked it up to basically going into other people's homes. And even if I was wearing a mask, I had a beard, and potentially I was getting hit from these toxins from being in other people's homes. And then 6 months later, or actually 9 months later, it was August, so 8 months, my AC overflows and I'm removing the continuous flooring. I get to my master bedroom. I pop the baseboard on the opposite side. And sure enough, I was looking at Chatomium. I knew it right away. As soon as I popped the baseboard, I knew what I was looking at.
So that's a type
And
of mold.
yes, it's a
Okay.
type of mold, Chatomium. It's a toxic mold. It's a wet mold, right? So we'll be talking about wet molds and dry molds. So there was Chatomium behind the baseboard, and then I was like, okay, well, if it's right here, what else do we have? So I set up proper containment and then did the cuts. And sure enough, there was another type of mold. It's like kind of a green and light brown. and that was Aspergillus penicillium. I tested both of them just to confirm, but I have a pretty good idea of what I'm looking at once I see it colonized.
Mm-hmm.
So it was in basically three-fourths of the master bedroom. So there was these two different molds that were fighting it out because mold is territorial. So when you get another mold encroaching on one mold space, it will start releasing a poison. It's called a mycotoxin. It's myco is the Greek word for fungus, and it's this poisonous substance that mold uses to defend its territory. So I thought I was in a, safe zone, and it wasn't. It was a biological warfare zone. So,
Right.
and interesting enough, the mycotoxin trichothecene, or T2 is what they refer to it as, actually does get used and has been used in biological warfare. Like in the Persian Gulf, it was actually cultivated and that gas was used on the US troops, right, as a biological weapon.
Right.
So
Took people out.
yeah, so that's where you start kind of adding this up and you go, okay, if they're using it for biological warfare, and then you take it, maybe not so harsh, and for some people it's more recreational, and they're kind of getting a kick out of the mycotoxin, which is the magic mushrooms, and what they're releasing, and then you go, oh, and then there's another end of it, which actually could be for health reasons, which is the antibiotic penicillin comes from penicillium, and you start realizing that fungus and the mycotoxins that it releases has been used for multiple reasons, but those all impact the body. And for some people, the antibiotic penicillin can be fatal, right?
Mhm.
For somebody
Right.
who has a reaction to that. So I think that these things all kind of add up to a very industry that's in its infancy, and really people not understanding the true impact that mold and its byproducts can have on your physical well-being.
Yeah. One of the things that I've learned, diving into mold and all of that is that the EPA says it's dangerous and the doctors say it's not. And then, everything in between with the diagnostic and treatment and everything, it's, Russian roulette. Basically, you're lucky if you find somebody who cares and actually knows what they're doing versus just wants to sell a product. Also, I think the lack of education on what the process is supposed to look like harms a lot of people because I have people move from home to home to home and the mold just follows them. And we talked about that in the last episode. Um, so let's talk about the wet molds and the dry molds. Again, you're in Florida,
Yes,
I'm in Phoenix. I think that, with everybody living in kind of different environments, understanding the differences and what to look for, I think is going to be really helpful.
absolutely. So you obviously have contrasting climates with, Phoenix and Tampa Bay, right?
Yeah.
So you guys are extremely dry most of the year, and we're at like 70 to 80% relative humidity on average year round. So that's where the dry molds, when you say dry mold, what does that mean, really? It's a mold that can actually start growing with the moisture or the water droplets that are airborne. They don't need a constant source of water to start growing. They do have a constant source of water, but it's airborne, it's relative humidity. So mold can start growing at 60% relative humidity. And a mold that will start growing at that level is considered to be a dry mold. So the most common is actually Aspergillus penicillium. And those two are kind of clumped together because they can't really tell the difference under a microscope. So they just call it Aspergillus penicillium rather than, they can't see. When I see it with the visual eye, I can tend to differentiate because the Aspergillus tends to be more white and the penicillium tends to be more green, from my experience. But it also has different shades, like a sort of a light brown greenish color, and it might be kind of both of them at the same time. So that's why you always do want to get it tested, and at least you have a better concept. But at the end of the day, why is it important? Because, there's not really one mold that you can go, oh, that's okay, and these are not. So when I hear that, this kind of brush off sort of response, oh, it's not one of those bad molds. oh, it's not one of those toxic molds, right? And I hear that often, especially from in look, I love real estate agents and they definitely serve there's a need for them, but you also don't want to kind of have this sort of glib brush off response of, oh, that's not that big a deal. That's not one of the toxic molds. Because look, to me, any mold is not a mold that you want in your home. Now, the other thing that's also true in that statement is people, they say, well, look, it's Florida. Every home's going to have some mold, which is also true to a degree. What is true about it? Every home is going to have mold spores. It's a naturally occurring phenomena that does happen. It's outside, it's everywhere. And the spores are microscopic. And there's air transfer, there's air current, and you're going to have outside air getting into the home. It's part of life. But there's also what's considered a safe amount, what's considered elevated indoors, and is there colonized mold, which is I think the most important differentiation is colonized mold is that mold that you can see with your eye that's growing, it's spreading roots. And I don't think there's any amount of colonized mold that's acceptable. Because if it's starting to colonize, you're usually way past the point that you want to be. And then there's the other factor, which is colonized mold will release more spores and it will also release mycotoxins. Most molds are going to release a mycotoxin. So there's that differentiation that is really important.
So I have a question. Again, I social media and all that, you read a lot of things. And going into winter, there's certain people who will be like, "Oh, you need to get your HVAC looked at and all of that because when the mold starts drying out because winter air, the heater is really dry, then the mold dies off and then the spores fly around more." Is that true? Because like here in Phoenix, like I said, it's February and July, right? And so a lot of times there are leaks that happen, whether it's through the windows or we get like sideways rain. So sometimes it'll come in through the attic vents,
Mm-hmm.
that are supposed to keep the attic dry, but the water goes in and then it comes down and you don't always know it. There's not always a visual leak or a bubbling or cracks or anything, but it's up there, right? And then it dries out because we are very dry here, 15 to
Mm-hmm.
30% humidity most of the year. So is that true that if it colonizes and then dies, it's more dangerous than if it's colonized?
I don't think that it's true that it's more dangerous,
Okay.
right? I think that it is true that it is something to be concerned about. And the thing that you should be concerned about is the cross population because mold doesn't die. When it's dry, it just goes dormant. So those spores, similar to like if you buy, a pack of seeds at the grocery store and you're going to plant them in the garden, right? What those are dry. They are
Right.
innate. They're not alive or dead. They have the potential to be alive if they have the right climate, if they have enough, nutrients, water, and oxygen or whatever it needs. So it has the potential to be alive. So when mold dries up and you have spores, those spores can obviously become lighter. They can flow with the cross ventilation. And then later on, when it's wet enough, they can germinate and they can actually hatch and start growing roots. And then you have more colonization. So, is it true that you want to kind of like make sure that you don't have mold in your home? Yes, but it's a kind of a blanket yes. It's not like this time is worse or better than the other. You just really don't want colonized mold in your home. And when you think about it, the mold spore itself can create a reaction. So when you hear like mast cell activation syndrome, or you hear chronic inflammation response syndrome,
Hmm.
and you hear about these different, you know, symptoms or these labels for these problems, right? And I'm glad that somebody figured out that, hey, this is a thing and gave it a name because now that it has a name, we can do something about it.
Right.
But what is actually occurring in most cases with a lot of that, you're actually having a histamine release that is occurring because you're inhaling a foreign invader into the body. So similar to like getting stung by a bee or bit by a mosquito, what happens? You start to itch, it swells up, it turns red. So if you're inhaling mold spores, it's
What
acting
happened?
as a foreign invader into the body. Chronic inflammation response syndrome, right? Boom, you have so these things, or the mast cell activation syndrome, because
Mhm.
of the mast cells are releasing more histamine. Just your body is now becoming more active. And obviously, I'm not a doctor; I'm a mold guy, but I've talked to enough of the functional medicine doctors or integrative medicine doctors and done enough research to have a pretty good concept of what is occurring. So I'm not
Right.
offering physical advice. I stay in the home, but these are some of the things that I recognize is caused by the problem that I do solve, which is mold in the home.
Right. You recognize that it's not isolated to just being a home problem, but it causes major health issues, which it does. I've recently learned that a lot of times cancer is the body's way of collecting all of the toxins, whether it's pathogen, a mold is a pathogen, right? So when we talk about pathogens, it can be viral, it can be environmental molds, environmental, whatever. And the body's collecting all of that poison into one spot to protect the rest of the body from it, right? And then if you remediate and then you take care of it in the body, sometimes it can reverse. And so mast cell activation syndrome, a lot of times it goes to the gut. The gut has fungus all throughout it, or, there's some sort of pathogen. And then the body can't, and then histamine builds because that's what our body does to protect ourselves. And then it makes us sick because the body can't get rid of it. Again, chronic inflammation, it's the body's trying to protect itself. It's that red swelling that's happening inside versus visibly on the outside. Although a lot of times there's a lot of outward visible symptoms that are just brushed off as well. So I love that you understand that it's a holistic thing and it's not just, the house.
And to your point, like if anybody follows on Dr. Jill Carnahan, right? So she just recently did a post where she was talking about some of these cancers and they're finding, fungal growth,
Yep.
right?
And it's mind blowing. Like it's totally new. They're really breaking down the tumors and going, what is this? And it is. It can be viral. A lot of times it's fungal, which is super interesting. And other times it's parasites. But again, it's that pathogen category, but it's amazing how much of it is fungal.
So you have these microscopic pathogens that you can't see that are wreaking havoc really on the body. And until we start to understand that, we don't have a cure for cancer. Well, there's probably a reason why. We haven't actually found the right reason for cancer in the first place. That's where you get into like Mosaic DX. It has talked about some of these mycotoxins being linked to carcinogenic impact. Also, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia have, there's linked to various mycotoxins. And each one of these mycotoxin might create a different physical impact. So
Hmm.
these are things where it really needs to be not brushed off or kind of poo-pooed by Western medicine, but actually really taken into consideration as a primary culprit in some of these diseases. Because really, when you look at disease, it's probably either you're not getting enough of something that you should have, or you're getting too much of something that you shouldn't have.
Yeah.
And in the case of mold, it'd be too much of something that you shouldn't have, whether it's spores or mycotoxins, the poison itself, and the impact that it can have on the gut, the impact it can have on the brain, the impact that it can have on the skin. You know, you
Yeah.
you talked about this point of sometimes you can see it outwardly. There's this one particular mold, and back to that point of like wet molds, dry molds. There's one mold that kind of fits almost in between, which is a mold called cladosporium that loves low temperatures. It will grow in a low temperature. So it will infiltrate the air conditioner, which it tends to be a cold place and it's wet. You look at why do we refrigerate food? Because most molds won't grow in a cold environment. Well, cladosporium will. And cladosporium is a toxic mold and it can actually lead to skin infections, whether it's topical or under the surface. And it's one of these ones that is entirely brushed off, even by some mold inspectors, that it's like, oh, that's no big deal. Every home's going to have some of that mold. It's a naturally occurring thing in AC units. Look, just because it's common doesn't mean that it's ideal,
Right.
right? That's like saying, oh, the common cold. Yeah, no biggie. Just kind of walk. Look, if you have a cold, you should stay at home until your body gets better, right? So in the case of having cladosporium that's infested your air conditioning unit, you want to clean it up. You want to get rid of it. I've had entire families that have been severely sick because of their exposure to not just the cladosporium spores, but the mycotoxin that cladosporium releases.
Because the AC jiggles it, so it feels threatened, right?
Of course,
Yeah, that's what we
right?
talked. I remember we talked about that in the last episode. Okay, so just because you live in a dry environment, mold absolutely can and is a thing, and it's important to get that looked at. Now let's talk about these wet molds.
Sure. So the wet molds are going to come from a 90% moisture content. So that's something that's important to understand the difference of. Relative humidity is the amount of like water droplets in the air compared to the temperature. And there's a whole algorithm that you use to figure out what the RH is. But the simplest way to put it is how many water droplets in the air. Okay. Yeah. So then you have wet molds, which is moisture content. It's the amount of water in a substrate, in an actual type of material. So if you take a pin meter and you kind of put it into the wall, right? You're like putting it in, those two prongs will tell you kind of what the moisture content is of that material. So, and look, you can have wood decaying fungi will start growing at 20% moisture content. So there is some fungus that will grow at an even lower moisture content. But the one that most people know about, which is black mold, which is Stachybotrys chartum,
Mhm.
okay, that's the technical term for black mold, grows at 90% moisture content. So it needs to be wet. And that mold, again, it's considered to be more toxic, and probably there's truth to it to the degree that trichothecene is being used as a biological agent for warfare, right? But at the same time, that may be cause one host of effects where another dry mold is still wreaking havoc on the body. So there's probably 6 or 7 different molds that I see on a daily basis that are considered wet molds. You know, they are wet molds, like Stachybotrys chartum, Chaetomium, Eucladium, Trichodermia, and there's a few others that are considered.
So for those of us who are not in the industry, what colors are we looking for?
I mean, look, it's like taste the rainbow, right? There's all kinds of different colors associated with these different molds.
Yeah, like people think about black mold or like we talked about, the dry mold, which is the one that's white and green on bread and cheese foods
Hmm.
like that.
Hmm.
And then I'm thinking about like in showers, typically what I see is a lot of pink,
Yes.
or
So
red.
the pink tends to be bacterial.
Oh, interesting. Huh.
Now, not always, but it does tend to be bacterial.
I
Okay.
always thought that was mold. Huh. Learn
So
something new.
it's something that you still want to handle because
Right.
and look, in some cases, it might be the actual bacteria that is causing some health issues. But if you are covering all your bases and you're doing a whole home sanitization after a remediation project, the side benefit of that is you're also going to get rid of some of these bacterial pathogens as well. So
Huh.
yes, but
Super
you do have
interesting.
a bunch of different colors when it comes to mold. I've seen purple, I've seen orange, I've seen pink, I've seen black, I've seen green, white, brown, so it's kind of all over the place when it
Hmm.
comes to mold and the pigment. But the most important thing to kind of check for is water intrusion issues, or ensuring that if you have a leaky pipe, or how do you prevent having a leaky pipe. For example, when you have like a deep freeze, which is about to happen in certain locations, how do you prevent that? Well, if you're running cold water and warm water at the same time, that's going to be way better than your pipes freezing and having them burst, and you have thirty to $40,000 remediation project than spending a few $100s on your water bill because you kept that water flowing,
Well, I
you
guess
know.
also it could be like, what if the cracks pipe or the pipes crack, right? Like even
Yes,
if it's just like a little teeny tiny sliver and it's
yes,
just dripping, right?
yes,
Constantly, or so I have a friend whose husband is like or was an attorney for State Farm, and they moved around a lot, and he would never ever ever get a fridge with a water dispenser. And if it had
yes.
one, he would take it out because those are like the biggest sources of long-term water damage because they usually go into the wall or into the ceiling, and you don't know that it's dripping for months or years, and it causes it, and insurance companies don't cover it because it was a maintenance thing that you didn't know was a thing. And it does it the mold can be extensive. It can be all throughout the house and in everything, and they're like, well, that was on you, right?
And truthfully, that in itself, when you look at the what is the worst case scenario, it's a long-term leak that is hidden.
Right.
That's the worst because that moisture just kind of continues to spread, right? It becomes saturated over a long period of time.
And drywall,
So
just paper, is a perfect medium.
it's perfect. Or how about even wood floors, right? If you have wood floors, if you have drywall, or even behind cabinets where that, cabinet backing hits up against the drywall, and if it's wet and it's wicking, there's no ventilation, it doesn't dry out, it's dark. So the amount of times we've had like a slow drip or leak, and we've opened up the cabinets and it's all behind the cabinets. It's like it's insane. It's actually, that is a little bit terrifying when you see that, because that's also been where the woman of the home, or, in some cases, the guys are spending some time cooking, and, there's already humidity. You have your dishwasher there, you're washing dishes, you have a slow leak in the mold. And now that it's there and colonized, even Stachybotrys, now that it's formed, it can get enough moisture to activate the growth, and in some cases the production of mycotoxins, because now it's growing, it's going. It's similar to, like, if you have a vehicle or car outside and it's running, no big deal, right? We have a bunch of them. Obviously we're going for the whole zero emission thing, but there's off gassing that naturally occurs with a car. But now if you go into a garage and you close the doors, and you close the garage, and you have the car running, and you're sitting there, it's not good for the people that do that.
Right.
Very similar to a home that has colonized mold, and it starts going and it's activated. It's growing and it's going and it's flowing the mycotoxins in a very airtight environment because the homes have become more energy efficient. Now the people in the home are getting poisoned and they don't even realize what's causing it because it's hidden.
It's hidden and dismissed.
Yes, that as well,
Yeah.
right? Because I've
Right.
even seen it where it's clear as day that it's there and they're living with it. And you're like, how on earth? And they're not doing the math. And of course, some people are more sensitive than others. And there's also acute impact, and then there's long-term impact. So somebody might be like, oh, it doesn't bother me. I'm not the canary in the coal mine. I'm good. And then 40 years later, they're like, oh, why am I forgetting everything? Oh, why can't I remember your name? You just told me that, 2 minutes ago. Well, you've been impacted, right? Your brain and your neurological system has mycotoxins that are interrupting the communication that should be taking place.
Or the just as the health coach in me, like I know people have chronic sinus issues for like 20, 30 years.
Yes.
And it's mold that's colonizing your
Yes.
sinuses because your
Yes.
sinuses and all that are technically your intestines and all that are out technically outside of the body. Or they have major gut issues or, fungal infections all the time. And they just keep using the band-aids, right? And so a lot of times people don't think of like even seasonal allergies are just like, okay, the mold spores are higher and or like it's dry, you're drying it out because you're taking Sudafed and then you're getting just like it's a very interesting thing. Like, yeah, there's, the cancer, there's the dementia, there's all of that, but there's also very real everyday things that people are getting unnecessary surgeries for because they can't breathe through their nose and all that. Like I remember I think I had like 4 sinus infections in a year. And I went to one of my doctors and they were like, "Have you heard of a neti pot with oil of oregano?" And I
Mm,
was like, "Huh, no." He's like, "Well, before you do antibiotics, try that and see if it gets rid of your sinus infection because most sinus infections are fungal." Lo and behold, I haven't had to deal with a sinus infection in 15 years.
look at
Like,
that.
I start feeling something coming on. That's what I go to. I do a grapefruit seed extract, so antibacterial. I have my antifungal. I do that for I do it 3 or 4 times, 36 to 48 hours, and all my symptoms are gone.
That's huge. I
Yeah,
mean, that's something that would be phenomenal. Actually, I should probably, we don't like adding a lot of humidity to our environments, but if you kind of have a proper balance, and I think that the essential oils and like grapeseed extract and these types of things are fantastic. And, I would love to get a little bit more information on exactly what mixture you use because I
yeah,
think it's crucial. And if you look at even some of the surgeries that people are getting, right? They're literally cutting open their body to
yeah,
handle some of these issues that are just ignored fungal issues
right.
because absolutely the mold starts growing. Like when people think about toxic mold or mold fatalities or things that are brought about because of mold, aspergillus is not one of the ones that kind of people think about at all. But it
Right.
actually, when you look at and you do the actual math on it and you look at the numbers, it causes more fatalities than black mold because of aspergillosis, where the mold actually starts growing in the body.
Hmm.
And if you think about it, like you inhale the mold spore, what does a mold spore need to start growing?
Moisture.
Water,
Hmm.
oxygen, and nutrients, right? So it's kind of like it's all there.
Right.
So that's where you really want to do like these remedies that you're talking about to break down the mold spore before it has a chance to start growing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do it like I don't do them. I used to do them like much more regularly, and I haven't. I'm like, I should probably start doing that again. But like now that we're talking about it, but it's always like one of those things when I start feeling stuffy or I feel a sinus infection coming on. That's what I go to, right? Everybody thinks about black mold. I've seen people get really, really sick from black mold very quickly. I've seen women who didn't change the diet, didn't change the way that they ate, and they gain 100 pounds in 8 months, and they have no idea why. Their thyroid's fine. They do an extensive thyroid panel, like they're doing all the things, and it was black mold in their office, right? So I think with that acute is the black mold is really acute. It's really easy to
Yes.
see. It's detectable in a lab, right? It's not
Mm.
subclinical. And I think a lot of the molds that people deal with are subclinical. Like it's not something that we regularly test for, number one. Two, that's given much thought in the medical world. Then it's not causing severe enough symptoms to be like, I can see it.
Yes.
You were in it, two and two together. Like that's a really easy thing, I think, for doctors to go, okay, that makes sense. Where the subclinical, it just requires a lot of digging and a lot of time that doctors don't have time for, aren't trained in, don't, haven't been told that there's value in. And it is frustrating. So I guess I want to come back to Phoenix a little bit, just again, because
Yes.
I'm here and
Of
I work
course.
with a lot of people here with the dry molds, right? So again, we are only at high humidity for 2 to maybe 4 months a year, depending on the how rainy the seasons are. But that's enough time for mold to definitely grow and then dry out, get agitated, release, right? So, which like I also know that there's molds on food. Some of those are normal amounts, things like that. So people are getting, the mycotoxin testing, and they're like, you have these, but don't worry about them. These are the ones you need to worry about, type of thing. So it's like when people, if they live in a dry environment, like my asthma and stuff got better when I moved from Tennessee, where there was just mold in the air all the time. Everywhere I was on like three different inhalers just to be able to breathe. Came to Phoenix, it did get much better for me, right? But there's still mold here. And I help people who are super, super sick all the time, who've born and raised here, haven't lived anywhere else. So it's like, what outside of testing, what other things can give the people hints that that this might be an issue?
I think if you have a physical thing that starts to flare up or it starts to hit and it wasn't there before, you should start looking at mold as a potential cause. So, it's interesting what you're telling me about. It reminded me of a friend of mine. Her name is Brittany, and she's a yoga instructor, and she was here in Florida. She moved here from California, and within 6 months of being here, she's a yoga instructor. She's a beautiful girl, model, and then all of a sudden her entire body starts breaking out in rashes everywhere from head to toe, right? And she actually ended up moving to Arizona for that exact reason. Like, she done the testing, found out that it was because of mycotoxins and because of the mold. She was living in a condo that had mold in the HVAC, moved to Phoenix, and all of that was able to, within a year, she was able to get it to a point where it wasn't showing up on her body anymore. She had basically healed herself. Now, with that said, let's say she was in a home in Phoenix and you had a pipe leak and mold started growing behind the cabinets, and now she's already been predisposed, and this is now impacting her again. There's like a reactivation that probably very easily could occur now that she's in an environment that has elevated levels of mycotoxins and mold spores. But
Mhm.
in Phoenix, you're going to be more inclined, and I would be interested to see and check the HVAC systems in Phoenix, because you guys do have central heating and air
Oh yeah.
there. So there's a very good chance that you are going to have cladosporium that does build up because you are constantly having to use your air conditioning and it's constantly wet. So that would be, if I was in Phoenix, that's one of the first things I would be looking at is the HVAC. And then the other aspect of it would be the wet molds that are caused because of a leak, whether it's a roof leak, whether it's a pipe leak, whether it's you don't have proper drainage.
Right. So in my house, we have the AC unit that's outside, but then all the way across the house, I have part of it inside and with a drip pan underneath and it's supposed to drip outside of the house. And it doesn't always, and that can actually leak into the garage. And I had apparently my pan was full and the guy just like let it leak out of my ceiling. And I was like,
Yeah,
you are gonna put fans up there, right? Like that. I'm like, you just got all of my like wood and all of my insulation and everything soaking wet.
yeah,
And he
that
was
that
like,
was incredibly negligent on his
yeah.
part,
I was
right?
pissed. Oh,
So
I was so angry.
that's a really, now here's what I will say, that your chance of that being is, if that happened in Florida, 100% you're going to wind up with mold, because the material is not going to dry out fast enough, because it doesn't extract from the material. The air is so wet that it doesn't pull water out. Now, in Phoenix, could you potentially get away with that without having mold? Maybe, because it's dry enough that it will pull moisture out of the material fast enough. But definitely, I wouldn't be chancing it. I would not
Right.
be taking any sort of chance with people's health in their home. When it comes to, look, where there's water, there's life. And you can pretty much just take that to the bank, like rely on that datum. Where there's water, there's life. So if you add water to building materials, especially drywall or wood, there's a good chance that you're going to have mold afterwards. And that's, to me, one of the key places that I would be looking in Phoenix is the HVAC, because it's a constant source of water. This is probably a good place to talk about this. In I have a gift for your listeners, right? They can actually, we still have this available. It's a free download at moldebook.com. So there's 15 action points that we've kind of put together through going through 3,500 homes. And some of it may be applicable to people in Phoenix, maybe not all of it because of the difference in climate. But one of the things that, is in there, like one of the chapters is chapter 10, the many hideouts of mold. So it talks about the places that I look and have found mold in various homes. And of course, that's going to cover in Phoenix the places where there's water, your bathroom, your kitchen, the laundry room, where your HVAC is located. And to your point of so that system that you have is called a split system, where you have the condenser outside and then you have the air handler or the furnace inside, right? The air handler is where you're going to see the mold. And where we see it here is on the coils because the coils are constantly wet. And then we also see it forming on the blower wheel a lot of times, believe it or not. This thing that's spinning so fast, yet there's still mold on it because the metal gets cold enough that it hits dew point and water starts to form on it. And then the other thing, the way that they do HVAC here, which is different in like on the West Coast, they use a lot of ductboard, which is like this 1 inch thick porous material. So porous material, wet, what do you think is going to happen? You wind up literally with a petri dish, which is impacting your air quality throughout your entire house. And it's
Yeah.
probably like 80% of the homes here in Florida have that issue. And most people have no idea. Now, how bad is it in Phoenix? I haven't been there. I don't know, but it does to the point you made at the beginning of this conversation, the climates and the different climates can wind up leading to mold in different ways.
And just because we're a dry environment doesn't mean we're immune, which
Absolutely
explains
not.
why there's so much mold toxicity even here in Phoenix. Like it's not obviously as bad as where there's high mold in the air, right? Because like Tennessee, all the trees are dying and all the plants and all of that. I could always breathe better in the winter, even though it was cold, and cold aggravates my asthma, right? So, or your friend yoga teacher who had the whole body rash and moved to Arizona to get away from that, but it doesn't mean that you're immune. So being, not neglecting water is basically what I'm hearing is like, make sure that you are not neglecting where water is, make sure you're cleaning and doing the proper treatments as preventative measures, especially here in Phoenix. I think prevention is really going to be key, but even in wet environments is like prevention. And so, just because you are the expert, what would prevention look like? Like, what are some things that people can look into? They can Google, they can try to find a local expert to help them navigate.
Well, I think prevention first comes to there's kind of two datums. If you want to keep your whole home free and clear of mold, it needs to be clean and it needs to be dry. So those are kind of irreducible minimums, clean and dry. So what does that look like? Well, obviously you get rid of as much dust as you can. You have filters, HEPA filters, you do normal, vacuuming, do a deep cleaning, these types of things. But what does dry look like? Because dry doesn't always mean dry to the eye. So like I have a young couple that I'm helping right now where the mom has been sick and she can't figure out why. So my first question was, has there been a water intrusion issue that you're aware of? Yes, there was. Okay, great. Where was it? It was in the kitchen, under the sink. Okay. Did you guys remove the cabinets? No, no, we put fans on it. Okay. Did you get it done by a professional? No, we just put fans on it and it dried out. Okay. So we put a borescope under the cabinets, and there's like a full colonization of mold all throughout those cabinets and underneath it. Of course, she's basically been poisoned being in the kitchen, not knowing that there's mold underneath the cabinet. She can't see it. And why? Because they didn't get it dried out professionally. Because the way to dry that out would be to remove the kick plate, drill holes in the bottom of the cabinets, and make sure you inject enough air that it dries it out fast enough that you don't wind up with colonized mold. Building materials are going to have mold spores on them. They come from outside, they were in storage. So once you put water on it, the chances, and now you have the right material with water and spores, you're going to wind up with growth. So it really is important preventative to make sure that if you have a water intrusion issue in the home, that you get it professionally dried out. Even though you may not want to spend the money, the people that know how to dry are going to be using moisture meters. They're going to be keeping dry logs. They're going to be keeping humidity readings. They're going to look at the reduction and how quickly it goes. And they should know that mold can start growing within 48 to 72 hours. So if you don't dry it out fast enough, it can lead to microbial growth.
So I guess I have a question. Like some people might try to do it themselves, realize, oh, you know what, this is not working. Then they bring in the professional. Is there something that can be sprayed or something like that in like, oh, okay, like wood cabinets or things like that, that can like mold inhibitors? Is that a thing?
Yeah, of course it is. There's certain products but how are you going to spray it under your cabinets? Like you would
Well,
need
if the
to.
kick plates are off, if there's holes in can you just like, is it like, I'm just kind of thinking, I remember when I moved into a rental and they like had cutouts around pipes so water could get in behind the siding and stuff. And so I used like a spray foam that like expanded to fill in those holes, right? Like, so I'm thinking like, we talked in our last episode about foaming agents and things like that. So I guess my question is like, is there something like that like for someone like me that's like super vigilant about like no mold, if there was something extra I could add that worked, I would want to use that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So one thing that is a antifungal product is thyme oil or thyme oil,
Oh, okay.
however you want to
Yeah.
pronounce it, right? You can get BioEsk or Decon 30. Like I'm not trying to sell a product, but these are some products that work, that are antifungal in nature, that are going to obviously inhibit mold growth.
Okay.
Now, I would not recommend necessarily going and spraying colonized mold with a product like that because you're going to agitate it, aerosolize it, and cause a
Right.
repercussion when that occurs. But could you, use this product to potentially break down mold spores? Also, a high concentrate vinegar is acidic enough that it should break down the mold spore, right? So
Hmm.
that's something I would definitely look at. Hydrogen peroxide is another product that I like a lot,
Yeah.
when it comes to destroying mold spores. So it's oxidative, so it's going to break down the mold spore. So, it's interesting. Some people talk about like products that weight down the mold spores and
Hmm.
then they kind of go and, vacuum them up. But I'm like, look, even if you do that, you're not going to get all of them through a vacuum.
Right.
It's just not very likely. You're fighting an invisible enemy. So I'm more like, yes, removal is always the best, 100%. If you remove the contaminated material, you remove the contaminated ducts, that's way better. But if you can use a product that will actually break down the mold spore and actually helps to dissolve mycotoxins, that is a really important step of a full remediation process.
Yeah. Like I was just thinking like if there's a water leak, what can we do to help prevent if
Hmm.
there's any moisture left? So that was really beneficial. And then of course remediation is a whole other game, which we talked about again in that last episode. But just to give people a quick recap, what like very, very brief. Let's say you do find colonized mold. What, you talk third person or third party testing. The people who test are not the people who remediate. And then what does the remediation process look like? How do you know if they're doing it right so that it doesn't spread throughout the house?
Well, look, I've been on those projects before. I've seen those projects where it's not been done correctly. And if the person is not putting up proper containment, that's your first red flag. You have to have, it's not just dust walls, but you want to have them sturdy and holding up, in the zipper, and potentially even like a decon chamber where you're walking through the decon chamber and now you zip that up and now you go into the containment zone as well. And then when you're doing you should have negative air setup where there's like a fan or an air scrubber that is being ducted outside. So it's taking that bad air and blowing it out, and mold in its naturally occurring environment is not considered to be hazardous or toxic. The solution to pollution is dilution. So you would have a negative air setup, and then you would have controlled demolition or precision demolition, where you're cutting out the drywall as precisely as possible, as dust free as possible. Usually you want to have like a chalk line, and you want to make those cuts that are precision, and ideally like in 2 foot by 18 inches, so that it's going into a construction bag that is 4 to 6 mil thick. It goes in there. You want to double back it and then gooseneck it and tie that up. And ideally, you don't bring it through the house. It could go through a window, outside is kind of the better way to do that. But if not, you definitely want to have that double bag so you're not bringing potential spores and dust through the main living area. And then you want to treat the actual contaminated material. If it's structural, and you can treat it and, destroy what's on the actual surface of your studs or your wood framing, do that. Clean that all up, make sure that it's spotless, and then you do a full HEPA vacuuming and wipe down using an antimicrobial product like Decon 30 in that entire environment. And usually even out of containment in that room that's been impacted, I would say do the HEPA vacuum, do the wipe down in that room. And then after all of that is done, then you can take the negative air aspect of it off, remove the ducting, and just have the air scrubber going for at least 24 to 48 hours. But before I would do that step, I would also strongly recommend doing duct cleaning and then doing a whole home sanitization on that space, because the mold spores and the mycotoxins are light enough that just through air current and the way that HVAC system is designed, you have a return air and a supply air. So you're constantly pulling air into the system and then distributing it back out through the ducts. So you want to keep that system as clean as possible and do like a duct cleaning. And then right after that, do a whole home sanitization to address anything that may be airborne that may have gotten out before you actually did your remediation process, or even potentially during your remediation process, because it's never 100%. There's nothing that's absolute. So I would say that probably is your best bet in terms of, in that if it sounds expensive, it's because it is, right?
Right.
There's a lot of work that goes into that when you think of those steps. So that's why having the mold prevention in mind is so important. Again, moldebook.com, how to prevent mold. How do you make sure that you don't wind up with a problem in the first place? Because if it's there, it's never super easy to handle,
Yeah. Thank you so much for explaining the different types of molds, the health impacts of it, and then just giving people an overview of what the remediation process looks like, because we don't know. And if we don't know, we can be taken advantage of. So it's really nice to know what to look for and to make sure that we can participate in the process. I think is really important, whether it's health, whether it's home, anything like that. And then I will link the ebook and then your website and stuff in the show notes. Is there anything else you want people to know before we let them go?
Yeah, look, there's a particular group that I am a big fan of. I have no connection with the woman who started this group. Um, but it really is, for me, one of the most valuable groups on mold that I've found. And although I haven't met the woman who started it, one day I would like to meet her. The group on Facebook is Mold and Toxins Healing Your Home and Body. And the lady who started it, her name is Kendra Seymour. And she's not a remediator, but believe it or not, she did the same training that I did. And there's really only about 50 of us nationwide that have done the training. There's only 4 of us in Florida, which is, remediation for sensitized individuals. One of the group that does the certification is a group called NORMI, the National Organization for Remediators and Microbial Inspectors. They have this whole training for people that are sensitized so that, the remediator is aware of the health impact of it. And Kendra, although she's not a professional remediator, has done that training. She also started a nonprofit foundation, Clear the Air Foundation, I believe, or something along those lines, that is, it's a great resource as well. So I think that in terms of spreading knowledge and awareness, there's a lot of great resources that are free in that group that can also give people the bullet points if they do run into mold. And you have a group that I've seen groups that are like apathetic, they don't want answers, they or overhype it, and it's just not valuable at all.
Mhm.
Whereas this group, I have found it to be a lot more even keeled, and Kendra jumps in and points to the right resources to kind of keep it where it's like, look, yes, it's something to be concerned about. You don't need to be terrified. There are ways to handle it, and this is how you do it, and this is how you find the resources to make sure your home is as clean and healthy as possible.
That's incredibly valuable. And that's really what people want to know. People just want to know what they need to know. They don't want to be scared. They don't want to be dismissed. They just like, what do I need to know? So thank you so much for that. Again, I would love to have you back again. I know you have so much more to share. And if you decide to do a podcast, let me know so I can link it in the show notes too, because I know how much I don't know, and I feel like I know a lot compared to most. So I would love to be able to send people your way to get more information as well.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited about the podcast, the Mold Solutions podcast,
Yeah.
and I think it is important to have somebody who's been in the industry, who does know the health impact of it, who can talk to some of these myths and have other experts that are vetted, right, talk about it, and also people that have been impacted by it and how did they get through it.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot to this that spreading awareness and educating people, it's an inherent responsibility that you have once you know. Like,
Yeah.
that's kind of how it goes, right?
It's
So,
exactly how it goes. Well, thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to next time.
Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you found this episode helpful, would you do me a favor and help others find it by leaving a review, sharing a screenshot on social media, or sharing the link with a friend? By you sharing what you've learned, others are able to find this podcast and join our community. Be sure to check out my website, www.roadtolivingwhole.com, for over 160 delicious recipes, a variety of meal plans, and a blog packed full of even more healthy living tips. If you'd like to learn more about how to work with me as your coach, you can schedule a free consult through www.roadtolivingwhole.com/health-coaching/. Until next time, friend. Bye.